Hi, this is the 5.4 Cladistics video. It's quite a nice short one. Spec, if you want to stop it, not a huge amount of content. Okay, so a clade, and this is a definition that you need to remember. A clade is a group of organisms that has evolved from a common ancestor. So when we say a common ancestor, we mean at one point there was one species that diverged. Some of the species went to one environment, some went to another environment, and within those environments they adapted via natural selection. So think back to 5.2 where you did all about natural selection. Some clades could include thousands of species and some only a few, and it just depends on the features of the species and how they're being classified. And the way that we can classify them to find out whether species share a common ancestor and whether they're closely related is we can look at their DNA-based sequences and the amino acid sequences in proteins. Now, the reason we look at amino acid sequences in proteins is because the amino acid sequence is determined by the DNA-based sequence. So if two species have similar amino acid sequences within one of their proteins, then they must have similar DNA-based sequences as well. Okay, this is a cladogram. So it's a tree diagram that shows the divergence of clades. Now we start down here with a species. So at each kind of node, something is occurring, and there will be a species here, a species here, a species here. So what happens is this species has diverged, and some of the population became sharks, and some continued to evolve. Now you can also see that some of the nodes are labelled. So here we can see that this common ancestor here has developed a bony skeleton during this time. And so you can see here that then all of these animals would have a bony skeleton and then develop 4 limbs. So you can see that these all have 4 limbs, develop the amniotic egg. So these ones all have an amniotic egg, and so on and so on. Now it shows the most closely related species, which are the ones with the most recent common ancestor. Now here, birds and crocodiles are the most have the most recent common ancestor because it's just here. So these are the most recent common ancestors. This one is the most distant common ancestor. So the birds and the sharks are the least closely related. The crocodile and the birds are the most closely related here. And you must know how to interpret these cladograms and deduce the evolutionary relationships, and you must be able to suggest which ones are the most closely related and which are the least closely related. Okay, analogous and homologous traits. We kind of did this in 5.1. But homologous traits are traits that have a similar structure but a different function. So, for example, pentadactyl limbs. Species that have pentadactyl limbs include horses, humans, birds, bats, anything with a 5-digit limb. Analogous traits have a different structure but similar function. So, for example, the wings in birds and the wings in bees are very different, but their function is the same, which is to allow them to be able to fly. So you must be able to distinguish between the homologous and analogous traits, and then you need to be able to discuss the fact that homologous traits suggest that species have a common ancestor, because if they have traits with a similar structure, it must mean that at one point those traits were used for the same thing, and then the species diverged in the different environments, and evolution and natural selection caused the trait to be used in a different way. And the majority of homologous structures are internal, so it's not clear just by studying the visible features of a species. So you might not necessarily know that they're there unless you look internally, obviously after the death of the animal. So you'd have to study them quite closely in order to know. And then finally, you need to know about the reclassification of fig warts. In my opinion, this is a relatively boring example. However, this is the example that the IB have chosen. Now, the fig wart is a family of angiosperms, and you'll know from 5.3 that angiosperms are a plant phyla. There's more than 5,000 species of fig wart. Who knew? but what's happened is, as new information has come to light and there's been advances in technology and so on and so on, they've realised that the fig warts needed to be reclassified. So actually some of them weren't as closely related as they originally thought, but some of them were more closely related than they originally thought. So they separated one family of fig warts into 5 different clades of fig warts, and some fig warts were removed from families and moved into different families or into different genera due to the new information. So they kind of had to change them all around and reclassify them when they were able to look at things like the DNA base sequence and the amino acid sequence. That's all you really need to know, 5.4.